Greetings everybody, Nick D Virgilio here, and today's video is on how to EQ a kick drum. Let's go. The first thing I'll say on how to EQ a kick drum is that there's like 1,000 ways to EQ a kick drum. Every producer and engineer has their own way of doing things and their own tricks of the trade. My goal here today is to give you some tools and some tricks to get a great kick drum sound from the very beginning of the process all the way to the end when you're actually doing the EQing. The first thing I want to talk about is the microphones. Now, the microphone that was on the kick drum in the video studio where I was doing the actual playing was the Audix D6, but there's a lot of other fantastic microphones to check out and to use. Let's go through some of those. There's the always classic AKG D112, but there's also the AKG D12 and D12 VR, the Beta 52 from Shure. There's the Telefunken M82. This one's pretty cool because on the back of the microphone there's a couple of switches where you can engage a high-pass filter or a little bit of an EQ dip. There's also the Beyerdynamic TGD70. Now that's just a small sampling of all the kick drum microphones that are out there and what Sweetwater sells. Some are newer, some are older and classic. It all just depends on what you have in your studio and what you like. The next thing I want to talk about, and the first thing you should think about in the process, is the actual instrument itself. It all starts there. If you have a bad sounding instrument in the room, if it doesn't sound good, it's not going to sound good after the fact, after you add EQ on top of it. So listen to your instrument and what you have on it. What heads are you using? Because different heads will change the sound of your kick drum. What kind of kick drum beater are you going to have on your pedal? Do you have a fluffy beater that's going to have low attack, or a plastic beater like I used in the video studio that's going to have more attack? Think about all those things. Get the drum sounding great in the room, and then when you go to put EQ on it and you go to mix it after the fact, you're going to save yourself a lot of time and trouble. The drum I'm using in the video studio for the demonstration is a Tama Star Maple Drum, a fantastic sounding kick drum. I also have an Evans EQ3 kick drum head on the batter side, and I'm using a Tama Speed Cobra kick drum pedal with its plastic beater. So nice attack, nice round sound from that maple shell. Now check out how much the kick drum sound changes just by where you place the microphone in or around the kick drum. I brought in my good friend Ryan Marino from our Sweetwater drum merchandising team, and he just plays quarter notes, and I move the microphone in and around in front of the kick drum, all around inside the shell, and you'll be amazed on how much the sound changes. Check it out. So as you can hear, the sound changes quite a lot. Now I'm going to take everything we did in the video studio, open it up in Pro Tools, and show you how I EQ a kick drum. Now, let's listen to what we recorded first. Here's the whole kit with all the microphones on. Let me reiterate again what microphones I had on the drum kit, just so we're all clear here. There was the kick drum microphone, snare drum, there was an overhead mic, and a room or a microphone out in front of the kick drum for a little bit of ambience. Now, all of those working together make a kick drum sound. So when you're in the studio, when I'm in the studio, I have a session and I have lots of microphones on a drum kit, you know, multiple room mics, overheads, stereo overheads, plus, you know, the kick drum mic itself. There might be a microphone out in front of the kick drum, bottom and top snare drum mics, all the tom mics. You know, when all the mics are on, that all makes for the kick drum sound. When you EQ the overheads, you give them a little bit of high end, a little bit of air or clarity in their sound. That's going to affect the kick drum sound overall as well. So when we talk about EQing a kick drum, yes, of course, it affects the kick drum itself, but so do all of the other mics that are around the drum kit. It's worth saying right here, if you're working with only samples, say you program a drum part and it's just samples and there is no bleed from other microphones, well, it's a little bit different than what we're going to do here today. Today is all about EQing a kick drum with other microphones going on, a real live acoustic drum kit. With all that said, let's first listen to what I have recorded. Here we go. Pretty clean. Sounds okay, right? Oh yeah. All of the microphones were going into a Universal Audio Apollo and then on into Pro Tools. And I didn't have any of the mic pre-emulations on the Apollo, just the Unison mic pre, straight, no EQ, clean, directly into Pro Tools. And that's exactly what you're hearing here. I have the microphones mixed a little bit. You know, the snare drum mic is just a little bit hotter than the kick drum. Just kind of sounds like, to me, this is the right kind of balance for this. Let's play that again, and I'll play you every individual microphone just so you can hear how the kick drum is laying in the other microphones as well. So check this out. Kick drum on its own. Snare drum. There's a little bit of kick drum in the background. You can kind of hear it in there, right? The overhead mic. You hear a lot of snare drum, but you definitely hear kick drum in there as well. Start that over. Now this is the microphone that was out in front of the kit, or the room mic. Now this microphone is picking up a lot more kick drum than, say, the microphone above the drum kit. We're going to utilize all of these for the overall drum sound. So when you're in your recording session, if you get the chance to actually record the drums yourself with your band, or you're the producer, or you're just hanging out with the engineer, really experiment on where the mic goes. There's typical places. When we actually get into EQing the kick drum, I had the microphone in the typical place, right at the sound hole, with the microphone maybe exactly parallel to the sound hole, or maybe a little bit in, a tiny bit, right? But that's a typical place to put the microphone. A lot of times when you're doing sessions and you have multiple microphones on the kick drum, you'll have one on the inside and then maybe one on the outside in front of the head, not the hole, like a condenser mic, like pointing at the head. But in this particular case, we only have 4 microphones. It's all mono. So I put the microphone in its typical position. Okay, now let's get into actually EQing the kick drum. Whatever DAW you use will come with some sort of suite of plugins where you'll get some EQ, some basic stuff. Those will all work. I do recommend using a multi-band EQ so you have more options of what frequencies to turn up or down. Most of the time, I'll pick a 6-band EQ. That gives me lots of options, whether I want a high pass or low pass, and then I'll have lots of options for different frequencies in the middle as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a bunch of different EQs so we can go through each one and you can hear the sound difference and see how they work differently as well. The first one I'll pick is the stock Pro Tools plugin. It's called EQ7. This is a 7-band EQ. Looks like that. All the different colors are the different frequency bands. Another cool EQ to try out here is the Focusrite EQ, FFD2 6-band. Looks like that. If you're a UA Apollo user, a fantastic EQ that comes with the Apollo is the Massenburg EQ. It's right down here. MDW EQ5. This is a 5-band EQ. It looks like this. And I'll show you a trick with this EQ that is super cool. In fact, I'm going to stay on this one first. First thing I'll do is bypass the other two so we don't hear them doing anything. Now, a typical thing to do with kick drums is to pull down around 350 hertz. That sort of low-mid area that's usually just gets in the way of a lot of things. You pull that down, you make a little bit of a smiley face, and that's a real typical EQ curve to do. I'll turn this up to around 350 and just start pulling it down and check out how the sound changes. It really rounds out the bottom, right? Now the Q it's very thin, so a lot of that mid-range comes back. When it's really wide, it loses a lot of it. Now hear how the kick drum sound changes when I move the frequency back and forth. I'm right around 350 now. I'm going to go up and then back down. Changes quite dramatically, right? But for some reason, 350 pulled down is always a good way to go. It works with almost all kick drums, not every time, but it works quite a bit. Another great thing about this particular EQ is this function. See how you have the colored dots down here at the bottom? When you hit one of those dots, it turns on that frequency and all you hear is that frequency. Check this out. See, you're only hearing that. And now what I can do is go back and forth. And I can find those exact frequencies that are just poking out in a bad way. This works really well on snare drums and other parts of the drum kit. Maybe you have like a honk in the snare drum and you're hearing some sound that's going boo, boo. Well, you can turn this on and find that exact spot and pull it out quite easily. This kick drum is pretty dry, so I don't need this function as much, but it's super cool. Now you can do this with any other EQ where you could push up the frequency all the way to the top with a narrow Q. So you're just hearing that frequency, but you're also going to hear the rest on the outside. What's cool about this is that it turns everything else off and you're just hearing this frequency. So back to where we were. I pulled down a little bit of 350, about 5 dB worth. Sometimes it's good to put a high pass on as well. Now a high pass is rolling off all the really, really low end stuff. You set it to wherever you want. I have it at 80 Hertz here. Really, it's just gonna take away any of that ultra low stuff. When you're mixing a song and you're mixing a band and you have multiple things that are all playing a lot of low end, bass guitar, kick drum, your toms, keyboards that do a lot of low end stuff, it's gonna get thick down on those frequencies quite fast. So a high pass filter is a great way to just take the mud away from a lot of those things. I'm not sure we need to high pass this kick drum, but let's see what it sounds like. Obviously, the more I go, the low end goes away quite fast. We need low end for the kick drum. But we don't need too much low end down there. So I think that sounds pretty good. The next thing I would do would be to bump up a little bit of high end, give a little bit of snap to that beater. There's a number of ways you can do this. 4K as a typical spot in a kick drum that'll give you that snap on the beater. Let's check that out first, right around 4K. Let's see what happens when I turn this up. You can really hear it start poking out now. I narrowed the Q so we're a little bit more focused on this frequency. Let's move it around a bit and see what happens. One thing I like to do once in a while is just put a little shelf, a high-end shelf on the kick drum, anywhere from 10, maybe 8K, all the way up, and just kind of turn everything up a little bit. That snap of the beater sticks out nicely sometimes. Let's see what happens with that. Right now it's at 16. I'll move it back a little bit. Just turn up the shelf. You'll see the whole line move, right? All of those frequencies are moving up on this shelf as I turn it up. It's right about 0. Now let's play the kick drum and see what happens. Ooh, you can really hear the attack of the beater coming through. Not bad. May not need that much, but that sounds pretty decent. So right here with just a little bit of a high pass filter on, reducing some of those frequencies around the 360 Hertz area, that low mid mud, pulling out some of that and giving it a shelf EQ. I'm starting around 2K. I bumped it about 4 dB, so it's shelving a lot. You're really hearing that snap of the beater stick out now. Let's bypass this Massenburg EQ, because not everybody works on Apollos. Not everybody has the Massenburg EQ. Let's go to a stock EQ, the stock Pro Tools EQ, and see what happens here. Again, I want to start around that low mid area. Take it out of bypass. I'm going to grab the orange, which is right around 230. Let's find that 350 area, right around here. Pull this down and see what it sounds like. See, it's doing that same sort of thing as the other EQ was as well. Get really extreme with it if you want. Now, if you're doing a lot of metal music, some really fast, frenetic stuff, and you need the snap of every kick drum stroke, pulling out a lot of 100 might not be a bad thing for you. See how it gets nice? The clarity really sticks out. That's pretty cool, right? To me, that sounds good too. That's the typical 350 area. But here, you're taking out a lot of the mud. And then if you want to add a little bit more low end back into this, you can do something like that. This is a shelf. Let's make it so it's not a shelf, it's just a particular band. Make the cue more specific. Poke out some high end. Now that's a lot of EQ on a kick drum sound, but it's doing the job, right? Imagine playing some really fast 16th notes on the kick drum with a fast distorted guitar. This would poke out quite nicely. I'm going to bypass this one and finally go to the Focusrite EQ. This one has 6 bands. The 2 on the outside are the high and low pass filters. Then you have 4 bands in the middle. I'm going to turn this one down to around the 350 area, that typical spot, and let's see what happens. It's doing its same sort of thing. We'll make the cue a little wider. Really changing it up there. That sounds pretty good to me right there. Turn up a little high end on it. Not bad. If you want a little more snap right on the beater itself, let's find something right in that 4 to 2K range. Oh, hear that poked out just like that? Maybe make the cue a little bit more tight. So all of these moves really make a big difference in the sound. And all of the plugins are working generally the same exact way. The Focusrite and the stock EQ plugin from Pro Tools don't have that specific thing that the Massenburg thing does where it turns off all the other frequencies and you just hear that one, but you can kind of get to that same spot. Now, let me start turning on the other microphones in the room. Even though I'm only playing the kick drum, when I turn on the snare mic, the overhead, and the room mic, you're going to hear more of the ambience around the drum kit and see how it changes the sound. It's pretty neat. I put the stock Pro Tools plugin back on. I put a pull back the high end just a tiny bit. It was a little too much once I heard it again after having some fresh ears here. Now, next is the snare drum mic. Not much. Nothing really going on there. But what happens when I put the overhead mic on? Let's crank it up. That's very loud. We're not going to keep it that loud, but you can hear how the sound changes. Now, how about the room mic as well? It gets a little more pillowy. You hear a little bit more of the room. It's small, but you definitely hear those changes. Here's the room mic on its own. Now, I would typically maybe EQ a little bit of the room mic as well. So let's try that. Let's just grab the stock Pro Tools EQ here, the EQ7, and mess with this a little bit. Pulling out a little bit of that 300 area helps. There's a little bit of mud in there, right? If you just pull it back a tiny bit, I'm going back and forth to find the right spot. If I get extreme, it's like this. All the life is taken out of it now because I've gone too far. That sounds good to me. Around that 300 area, just pulling out a little bit is nice. Let me put the kick drum mic back in with just the room mic. It's pretty powerful, right? Back to the room mic. Maybe add a little bit of something higher up. Just a little bit of 4K to give it a little bit of air. All right, let's listen to the overhead mic on its own. Same thing. I'll put in the stock Pro Tools EQ, EQ7. Same idea. We'll start with pulling out a little bit of the low mids. Again, we're around that 350 area. Right now I'm at 335, and I'm going to go back to 0. Check out the sound. It's got that pillowy, but it's kind of like, there's a little mush there. It doesn't sound as clear as I would like it. But just a little bit of this low mid. I'm hearing the low end of the kick drum, and it just kind of cleaned out a little bit of that mud. Let's put on the kick drum mic with the overhead. Not bad. The kick drum, overhead, and room. Pretty cool. Now I'm hearing some snap. I'm hearing a little bit of roundness from outside of the kick drum. Plus, you're hearing the mic that's in the sound hole, so you're hearing the kick drum nice and close as well. Again, all of these things are making the kick drum sound. All right, now we're going to go back to where I was playing an actual groove on the kit. Everything's going, snare drum mic, all of the stuff. I'm playing a real beat. Now let's sort of dial in the sound of everything together. I'm going to bypass the EQs on the room and the overhead. I'm only using the stock Pro Tools plugin on the kick drum track for now, but we'll check out the other ones as well. Here we go. First thing I want to do is let's get the mix of the overhead right. One more time. Pretty good right there. Add a little bit of the room mic in. Now some of the close snare drum mic. One thing I would do here now, again, all of these things work together to make that sound. Let's put on that Massenburg EQ, and I can show you exactly what that thing does to find that exact frequency, that bad frequency you don't want to hear, and then I'll show you how to do it with a regular stock EQ as well. Kang, kang, kang. I'm hearing that tone coming out of the snare drum. Not exactly sure where that's at, but we'll pick the middle frequency here. I'll turn on the green button so I'm only hearing a frequency, and check out how this sound jumps out. Oh, hearing more of it? You kind of go back and forth and find the offending frequency. Then from here, you make the Q, make it negative here, and when you turn this on, it cuts that exact frequency. That's a little better, in my opinion. I would also put a high-pass filter on the snare drum. We don't need anything really low in the snare. Snare drum is a high-end instrument. cracking. You want fatness, but you don't need a lot of mud. That's a lot taken away. Let's go back, find the middle ground. And then we'll add a little bit of a bump in the high end. That's a lot, but it really starts sticking out nicely now, right? Now, I want to show you how to do this with a regular EQ as well, because it can happen. So let's put the stock Pro Tools EQ here. The other one's bypassed, and let's find that offending frequency with a regular stock EQ that doesn't have that feature. First thing you want to do is make the Q really narrow. You only want to hear that one frequency, or close to that one frequency. Crank it all the way up, and then just go back and forth. Oh. Hear that? Ooh, let's get rid of that. Crank it back up again. Oh yeah. Right around there is pretty good. I high pass with the Massenburg EQ. Let's do it here on this one. Turn it in. You can make this one pretty sharp, so let's turn that down a little bit. Get rid of some of the mud. Turn up a little bit of high end. Simple as that. So in general, with any instrument on your drum kit, if you need to find that offending frequency that's just sticking out, there's a honk or something like that, crank up one of the frequencies in your EQ plugin, make the Q really narrow, and then go back and forth till you find that spot that's just bugging you and pull it out. If you happen to have that Massenburg EQ or another one that will let you solo a specific frequency, so you only hear that, it's a little bit easier, but it's going to do the same thing. You're going to find the offending frequency and get it out of there. Okay, now let's check out the whole drum kit sound. I have EQ on all 4 channels, the stock Pro Tools EQ, on the overhead, the room, snare, and the kick drum. Let's hear what it sounds like, and I'll bypass all the EQs as we go and check out how the kick drum sound changes or doesn't change. Okay, I'm going to bypass the kick drum. Oh, I've changed quite a bit. See, it's more focused, a little more high end, a little bit of snap. Let's do the same with the snare drum. Pretty minimal there, but it is in the overall grand scheme, changing a little bit in the air. Changes quite a bit when you bypass the overhead EQ. One more time. This is with the room mic bypassed. Now, when you turn off the EQs of the room and the overhead mic, it's a little more subtle of what it does to the kick drum, but it's definitely a change. Listen to the kick drum sound, focus in on that, and I'm going to bypass the EQ on the room mic. Here we go. It took out a tiny bit of mud and added a little bit of air in the high end of the kick drum itself. One more time, let's listen to the overhead mic with the EQ turned on and off. That's off. On. To me, that's a big difference. You really hear the curve as we took out some of the 350, that lower mid stuff. We scooped that out. You really hear the difference there. And then one more time, I'm going to turn on and off the kick drum EQ. Oh, huge difference. So EQ does a lot of magic in your mix. It really can dial in and dial out the frequencies you want or don't want. Does that make sense? You have the choice to pick and choose exactly what you want to sculpt in and out of your sound to make the drums stand out more, to be more dull in the background. It all depends on what style of music you want to do and how you want it to sound in your mix. But in general, that 350 hertz is really a great thing to scoop out in so many situations when you're recording a kick drum. And I did roughly the same thing on all of the microphones with the EQ curves, just taking out some of the mud and bringing out the clarity a little bit. I'm trying on purpose not to go too far on any of these things because right now I'm just listening on headphones. It could sound a little bit different on your speakers or in your car. So these are the things that you have to experiment with in your own listening environment. But in general, for a kick drum, that 350 hertz area scooped out a little bit will work great for you. Now I'm just using multi-band EQs, the 7, 5, and 6-band EQs here in my DAW. There's other brands, of course. There's parametric EQs, there's graphic EQs, there's all kinds of different style of EQs you could use. There's channel strips, there's obviously compression and these kinds of things that will manipulate the sound of your kick drum as well. But I just wanted to give you a general overview of something that works most of the time. Again, it starts with the drum itself. Make sure your drum sounds as good as it possibly can. Decide on what kind of beater you have, the head, all of those things, how much dampening you have in your kick drum. The microphone you use to record your kick drum definitely makes a difference. The environment you record in makes a difference. So all those things coupled together make the kick drum sound. What I did here with you today is a nice, easy way to find and sculpt out those offending frequencies to bring out the life of your kick drum. The low end, the high end, that makes it crack, makes it punch, makes it fat. And one last thing I'll suggest, when you're sitting at home, you have your computer open, you're listening back to a track, definitely experiment with all the plugins you have in your system. Find which ones work for you the best. I have a ton of plugins on my computer here, but I definitely don't use them all the time. I have my favorites that I go to that I know how to use and know how to manipulate. When you find those things, your workflow will be just so much faster and so much easier. So definitely do that. And then don't be afraid to turn knobs up and turn things up and down and find out what they do. Find out the sounds that happen when you turn those things up and down and remember those things so when you go back the next time, it'll be much easier to find your place. All right, I hope that was useful and will help you get a great kick drum sound out of your recording session. Remember, it all starts from the drum first. Make sure that drum sounds great first, then the actual microphone placement, and then the EQing of the drum. Thanks so much for hanging out with me, everybody. We'll see you again soon. Cheers. Stagata pude dois bau.